May 1945. Northern Germany. The war was over, but the smoke hadn't cleared. A damp morning mist clung to the camp yard as rows of German women stood in silence. Hundreds of them, in faded gray and khaki uniforms that no longer carried power, only shame. Behind the wire fence, Allied soldiers watched without a word. The women were ordered to step forward, one by one, and throw their uniforms into the growing pile. Wehrmacht jackets, Luftwaffe skirts, SS clerical coats, all of them symbols of a regime that no longer existed. A command was shouted. The first match was struck. Flames leapt upward, orange against the dull northern sky, devouring what had once been a mark of pride and obedience. Some of the women stared as if hypnotized. Others wept quietly, and a few turned away, unable to watch the last trace of their service vanish into ash. It was not just cloth that burned that day. It was identity, loyalty, and belief, consumed by the fire of defeat, and yet this moment was only the end of a much longer story, one that began years earlier, when the Reich had promised them purpose, and the world still trembled before its power. In the early 1930s, as Germany rebuilt itself under Adolf Hitler's rule, a new national identity was being forged. Disciplined, loyal, and unquestioning. The Nazi regime, obsessed with order and total mobilization, recognized that war was not only fought on battlefields but sustained in offices, factories, and communication rooms. By the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, nearly 500,000 German women were already serving the Reich in auxiliary roles. They were secretaries, clerks, radio operators, nurses, and drivers. They wore uniforms, carried ranks, and saluted the same flag as the men who marched east and west. The propaganda was powerful. Posters showed smiling women beside soldiers. The caption reading, "Behind every man at the front stands a faithful helper." The message was clear. Service was not only duty, but honor. Training schools were established across the Reich. The Wehrmacht Helferinnen Corps, the Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen of the Luftwaffe, and the SS Helferinnen, attached to the most feared organization in Nazi Germany. Young women from Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna volunteered eagerly. Some sought adventure, others security, and many believed in the dream of a strong, united nation. At first, their duties seemed harmless, typing reports, relaying messages, or administering supplies. But as the war deepened, the machinery they supported grew darker. The telegraphs they operated carried orders for deportations. The trains they scheduled moved soldiers, and sometimes prisoners. Their signatures appeared on ration documents that decided who would eat and who would starve. Most did not see the front lines, but they were deeply embedded in the system that sustained the war. The Reich depended on them. By 1943, with German men dying in vast numbers on the Eastern Front, Hitler approved the total mobilization decree, calling on women to fill every non-combat role the military required. The war was no longer distant. Bombers thundered over German cities. Factories turned to rubble. Yet the uniforms remained immaculate, pressed, proud, and symbolic of order amid chaos. For many of these women, loyalty to the Reich was not fanaticism. It was structure, a life of rules and recognition in a collapsing world. They believed they were serving their country, not necessarily its crimes, but as the tide of war turned, that belief would be tested beyond endurance. When the Red Army began pushing west and Allied bombers turned the skies into fire, the women of the Reich faced a choice they had never been trained for: survival. The same hands that once typed orders and coded messages would soon be raised in surrender, and the uniforms that had once granted them identity would become marks of guilt. The fall of the Reich, from service to captivity. By the spring of 1945, the map of Europe had changed beyond recognition. The The red arrows of the Soviet advance pressed deep into German soil, while from the west the British, Americans, and Canadians cut through the Rhineland. The Reich, once proclaimed eternal, was shrinking by the hour. In cities like Königsberg, Breslau, and Berlin, women who had worn their uniforms with quiet pride now found themselves trapped in chaos. Trains no longer ran on schedule. Communications collapsed. The coded messages they once sent in confidence were replaced by desperate calls for retreat or surrender. Some of these women fled alongside retreating troops, clutching a single suitcase, part military, part civilian. Others stayed in hospitals and command centers until Allied forces arrived. The end came not with a ceremony, but with confusion and silence. When Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945, the illusion shattered. The Reich had no future, and its servants, male and female alike, suddenly had no country to serve. In the following weeks, tens of thousands of German soldiers and auxiliaries surrendered en masse. Among them were countless women in uniform, members of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and SS support services. Many were rounded up in the fields of Schleswig-Holstein, Bavaria, and Saxony, others in the ruins of Berlin itself. The Allies faced a dilemma. International law had little precedent for female prisoners of war on this scale. To most Allied soldiers, these women were not combatants, but they were not civilians either. Some had handled weapons. Others had served in camps or SS headquarters. The distinction between guilt and duty blurred into gray. In Soviet-occupied territories, suspicion turned swiftly into retribution. Soviet soldiers, brutalized by years of invasion and loss, treated all in uniform, male or female, as enemies. For many women captured in the East, captivity meant fear, humiliation, and silence that lasted decades. In the Western zones, treatment varied. The British and Americans organized makeshift camps to hold the growing number of female auxiliaries. They were searched, registered, and stripped of insignia. Interrogations began, not of battles fought, but of roles served. A teleprinter operator from Hamburg might be questioned about the messages she handled. A nurse from Warsaw might be asked which units she treated and why. The process was slow and humiliating. The war had ended, but punishment took another form, one that targeted symbols as much as actions. Uniforms, medals, and insignia were no longer marks of service. They were emblems of a defeated ideology. And to the Allied command, these symbols had to be erased publicly, decisively, and symbolically. That order would come soon, not from rage, but from policy, as part of a sweeping campaign known as denazification. Its purpose was simple: to purge Germany of everything that carried the mark of the Nazi regime, from propaganda posters to armbands, books, and flags. Even the simplest garment, a gray wool uniform stitched with an eagle and swastika, was considered dangerous. And so, in camps across the Allied zones, the command was issued. The women were to surrender their uniforms. They were to destroy them. For many, this was not an act of punishment, but one of forced transformation, from soldier to civilian, from participant to prisoner. As the fires were prepared and the piles of uniforms gathered, something deeper than fabric was about to burn. It was the final severing of identity, and the beginning of a long silence that would haunt post-war Germany for generations. The human angle. When the war ended, their lives fell silent. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the camps holding female prisoners fell into a heavy stillness. The air smelled of damp earth, burnt wood, and human exhaustion. The war had devoured everything: cities, families, beliefs, and now it had devoured meaning itself. For many of these women, captivity brought a strange emptiness. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They had not fought on the front lines or held rifles. Yet, they were treated as extensions of the enemy. Some wept not out of guilt, but out of loss, of comradeship, of certainty, of belonging. Their uniforms had been their shield against chaos. Inside them, they knew who they were: typists of the Reich, operators of precision, servants of order. Now, stripped of those garments, they faced themselves in plain dresses or issued rags, anonymous, indistinct, and nameless among thousands. Letters to families went unanswered. Many had no homes left to return to. The bombings had erased their streets, their workplaces, their pasts. Each sunrise in captivity reminded them that the world they had served was gone, and with it, the structure that had defined their lives. For the first time, many began to question not the war's outcome, but their own place within it. The moral angle: obedience or guilt? The question of guilt hovered over every camp interrogation table. Allied officers asked, sometimes with restrained anger, "What did you know?" But the truth was complicated. Most of these women had never seen the front lines, nor witnessed atrocities firsthand. Yet, the bureaucracy they supported made the war machine possible. A secretary in a regional SS office may never have fired a gun, but her typing skills filled deportation lists. A radio operator may never have seen a prisoner, but her signals guided units responsible for occupation and repression. The line between knowledge and complicity blurred beneath layers of obedience and propaganda. The Nazi state had trained its citizens to believe that duty was virtue and questioning was betrayal. Befehl ist Befehl, an order is an order, became the moral shelter for millions. Now, in the aftermath, that shelter collapsed. Women who once took pride in efficiency now felt the weight of moral reckoning. Some justified their roles as just work. Others broke down, confessing shame they couldn't fully name. There was no tribunal for them, no headline trials like Nuremberg. Their punishment was quieter: to live with the knowledge that their hands, however clean, had helped move the machinery of a regime that brought Europe to ruin. In burning their uniforms, they were not only obeying Allied orders, they were, in a deeper sense, confronting the ashes of their own obedience. The gender angle: the female face of defeat. Defeat wore many faces in 1945, but for women in uniform, it carried a particular humiliation. In German culture, shaped by centuries of militarism, uniforms symbolized masculine strength and honor. Women who had worn them had briefly stepped into a world of authority and status usually denied to them. Now, stripped of those garments, they were thrust back into vulnerability, physically and socially. Allied soldiers, many of whom had fought bitterly against Nazi forces, viewed them with suspicion and sometimes contempt. To some, they were enemies. To others, trophies of war. There were acts of decency, but also of abuse. The Geneva Conventions offered little protection for non-combat female auxiliaries. In Soviet zones, the treatment was often brutal. Thousands of women suffered violence that would remain unspoken for decades. In the West, the loss of uniform still marked them as guilty by association. Villagers spat at them, neighbors whispered, and former comrades avoided them. They were women caught in a paradox, once praised as patriots, now condemned as symbols of fanaticism. Their uniforms had elevated them. Their loss of them defined their fall. In the flickering light of the campfires, as gray wool turned to smoke, their transformation was complete. They were no longer the Reich's helpers, only its remnants. And yet, beyond this visible shame lay deeper layers of consequence, political, psychological, and historical, that would shape post-war Germany's uneasy relationship with its past. The political angle: erasing the symbols of power. In the eyes of the Allied command, Germany's defeat was not enough. Victory on the battlefield meant little if the ideology of Nazism survived in the minds of its people. The challenge now was not military, it was political. Thus began one of the most ambitious social campaigns in modern history: denazification. Its mission was to uproot every visible trace of the regime. Flags, insignia, portraits, and even the language of obedience itself. For the occupying forces, uniforms represented more than fabric. They were the skin of the Nazi state, its visual armor, its tool of psychological control. Every patch and eagle insignia reminded the German people of hierarchy, discipline, and fear. So, when female auxiliaries stood in camps wearing the same emblems that once filled the offices of the SS or Luftwaffe, Allied officers saw danger in familiarity. Allowing those uniforms to remain intact risked preserving pride, nostalgia, or quiet defiance. The order to burn them was therefore not born of cruelty, but of political necessity. Each garment destroyed was a statement. The old Germany was over. Across the British and American zones, these burnings often took place under supervision, a controlled ritual of erasure. Reports from camps near Lüneburg, Hildesheim, and Schleswig describe large pits filled with coats, caps, and armbands. British officers recorded the events in field diaries, noting that many women complied silently. Others hesitated, and some openly protested, pleading to keep at least a single sleeve or badge. But the order was clear. The Allies wanted no symbols left that could rebuild faith in the Reich. What the bombs had done to Germany's cities, denazification would now do to its identity. The psychological angle. When belief turns to ash for the women themselves, the burning of their uniforms was more than political cleansing. It was an intimate unmaking of self. Psychologists who later studied post-war Germany described this period as a collective collapse of meaning. Those who had served the regime, whether as officers, nurses, or clerks, had built their lives on a structure of belief, obedience, discipline, purpose. When that structure fell, they were left standing in a void. Burning the uniform symbolized a forced confrontation with that void. Some experienced it as punishment, others as relief. The act stripped them not only of status, but of illusion. They were no longer part of a grand mission, no longer sheltered by ranks or ideology. For years, they had lived inside a story, one written by the Nazi state, where their service had purpose and their loyalty, virtue. Now, staring into the smoke, they realized that story had been a lie. And when identity burns, what remains? Some later spoke of numbness. Others described shame so deep it silenced them for decades. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, a former Luftwaffe radio operator said quietly, "That day, I stopped believing in anything." Psychologically, it was the collapse of a self-image carefully crafted by propaganda. The disciplined, obedient helper of the Reich transformed into a powerless civilian watched by her former enemies. The ashes of those uniforms became, in a sense, the ashes of illusion. The historical angle, a symbol of a nation's reckoning. In the decades that followed, historians would rarely mention the burning of uniforms. It was overshadowed by larger narratives: the Nuremberg trials, the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe. Yet within the quiet margins of history, the event symbolized something profound. It represented the deconstruction of an identity that had gripped an entire nation. For centuries, German society had revered order, discipline, and hierarchy, values that the Nazi regime exploited to devastating effect. The uniform was its perfect emblem: clean, efficient, unquestioning. When Allied orders compelled Germans to destroy those garments, it was a symbolic act of liberation, though it didn't feel that way to those involved. It marked the beginning of Germany's forced introspection. The historian Hannah Arendt later described Nazism as a system that transformed individuals into functionaries of obedience. In this light, the destruction of the uniform was not merely punitive. It was the dismantling of a psychological machine. By the 1950s, West Germany's new government banned Nazi symbols altogether. Schools erased wartime imagery, museums stored away uniforms, and public memory shifted toward silence. The act that began in the camps, those fires that consumed cloth and insignia, had grown into national policy to never again wear belief as a uniform. And yet, even as the flames faded from memory, the human stories behind them remained. Stories of shock, loss, and awakening. Soon, those stories would converge at a single, unforgettable moment, when the order to burn the uniforms was carried out, and the last visible trace of the Reich was turned into smoke above the camps of a defeated nation. The order comes. May 1945. The morning began like every other in the weeks after surrender. Cold, damp, and silent. The war had ended, yet the air in the makeshift camps still felt heavy with command. In northern Germany, British units had set up dozens of temporary holding areas for captured soldiers and auxiliaries. The fields were filled with rows of tents and wire fencing, the ground muddy from spring rain. At dawn, the camp officers gathered outside the administrative hut. A small group of German women stood waiting, secretaries, teleprinter operators, and nurses from nearby units. Some still wore their faded gray uniforms. Others clung to civilian coats, scavenged during retreat. The British captain unfolded a document and read aloud, his voice steady and formal. All captured members of the Nazi armed services, male or female, were to surrender and destroy their uniforms. It was part of Allied Directive No. 38, the legal foundation of denazification in the Western zones. The text was brief but decisive. All uniforms, insignia, and symbols of the National Socialist regime shall be removed, confiscated, or destroyed. At first, few understood what it meant. Some women exchanged confused glances, expecting a simple collection or inventory. But the next line of command made it clear. They would burn them themselves. Just the long, uncertain work of returning to a country that no longer recognized them. For the world, the war had ended. For these women, it had only just begun. A war within memory, silence, and guilt that would stretch across the decades to come. The days that followed blurred together. Gray skies, gray tents, gray thoughts. After the fires, the women no longer spoke of uniforms. They spoke of food, of warmth, of news from home. The war's great ideologies had shrunk to small human needs. Across the Allied zones, thousands of female prisoners found themselves trapped between war and peace. The camps were crowded, improvised, and weary. Many of the guards were young men barely older than the women they watched. There was no cruelty in most camps, but no kindness either, only procedure. Every morning began the same way. Roll call, inspection, a list of names that meant little now. Then came the interrogations, the quiet rooms where Allied officers asked questions, not about battles, but about office work, units, and commands. What was your duty? Whom did you report to? Did you ever see prisoners? The soldiers prepared a clearing near the fence. Barrels were filled with fuel. Wooden crates were stacked as kindling. Allied guards kept a measured distance, watching but not interfering. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and metallic with the scent of rust and smoke. One by one, the women were ordered forward. A line formed, silent, uneven, faces pale from hunger and sleepless nights. Each carried her uniform piece by piece. Jackets, skirts, field caps, insignia badges, belts. A former Luftwaffe signals operator from Bremen hesitated. She pressed the eagle pin of her cap between her fingers, a tiny emblem of what had once felt like honor. The guard motioned with his rifle. Slowly, She dropped it into the pile. Within minutes, a small fire was lit. It spread quickly, the smoke curling upward in black threads. The wool hissed, the leather belts cracked, and the swastika patches disappeared under flame. A murmur rippled through the line. Some stared straight ahead, refusing to look at what they were ordered to destroy. Others whispered prayers, not to the Führer but to their fathers, brothers, and sons still missing in the East. The sound was unlike anything else in the war. No explosions, no shouting, only the quiet roar of burning fabric and the wind carrying ashes over the barbed wire. Nearby, an Allied interpreter took notes. In his journal, later preserved in the British National Archives, he described it as a curious scene, order restored through destruction. It was not vengeance. It was a cleansing, deliberate, bureaucratic, and final. Each uniform burned was another thread cut from the past, another symbol erased from the collective memory of Germany. And yet, among the watching prisoners, the act felt deeply personal. For years, those uniforms had been their identity, their proof of belonging in a nation that had promised greatness. To see them burn was to watch that promise dissolve into nothing. As smoke drifted toward the gray northern sky, the silence deepened. The women no longer cried or protested. They simply watched, motionless, as the last physical traces of their past lives turned to ash. The order was complete, but the reckoning had only begun. For in the hours and days that followed, the emotional collapse would come, a silent breaking within those who had built their sense of purpose on the illusion of obedience. Ashes and silence. The day after. When the last flames died, the field was silent. The women stood motionless, staring at the smoldering remains, blackened buttons glinting faintly among the ashes. A few reached for them instinctively, as if to retrieve what was lost, but the guards signaled them back. The order was final. Nothing was to be kept. The smell of burnt wool hung heavy in the air, mixed with the damp scent of soil and fuel. Rain began to fall again. Thin, cold drops that hissed as they met the charred ground. The fire pit turned to dark mud, swallowing what was left of the uniforms. Somewhere beyond the wire, church bells rang faintly from a nearby village. It was Sunday. For the first time in years, Germany was at peace. And yet inside the camp, peace felt like punishment. The women dispersed slowly. Some wept openly, their faces streaked with soot and rain. Others walked in silence, hands folded, eyes downcast. A few, perhaps out of defiance or disbelief, smiled faintly, the fragile armor of those who refused to break before their captors. One British guard later recalled in his diary, "They did not shout. They did not protest. It was as if they were watching their own past being buried. When it was done, they looked older, not from years, but from realization." Inside the barracks that night, the quiet was unbearable. Without their uniforms, many women felt stripped of meaning. The garments had provided a sense of identity, structure, and pride, even in defeat. Now, they sat in civilian clothes donated by the Red Cross, anonymous and indistinguishable. Psychologists who studied German prisoners in 1945 noted a recurring phenomenon: identity collapse. The sudden loss of purpose, coupled with humiliation and hunger, produced an emotional numbness. One camp report described it as a collective stillness, a silence of those who no longer know who they are. A nurse from Würzburg, interviewed decades later, remembered the moment vividly. "When they made us burn the uniforms, I felt like I was disappearing. I had believed I served Germany, not Hitler. But when the cloth turned to ash, I realized there was no difference left." For some, the burning was a form of forced awakening, an encounter with truth. For others, it was unbearable. A few attempted to hide small fragments, A button, a strip of cloth, a rank insignia smuggled in a shoe, not out of loyalty to Nazism, but because it was all they had left of who they had been. By dawn the next morning, the ashes had scattered. A light wind carried them across the camp fence into nearby fields. British soldiers noted the change in atmosphere, subdued, resigned, almost hollow. And in that emptiness, something else began to take root. The slow realization that survival now meant starting over. No more ranks, no more orders, no more uniforms, just the long, uncertain work of returning to a country that no longer recognized them. For the world, the war had ended. For these women, it had only just begun. A war within memory, silence, and guilt that would stretch across the decades to come. The days that followed blurred together. Gray skies, gray tents, gray thoughts. After the fires, the women no longer spoke of uniforms. They spoke of food, of warmth, of news from home. The war's great ideologies had shrunk to small human needs. Across the Allied zones, thousands of female prisoners found themselves trapped between war and peace. The camps were crowded, improvised, and weary. Many of the guards were young men, barely older than the women they watched. There was no cruelty in most camps, but no kindness either. Only procedure. Every morning began the same way. Roll call, inspection, a list of names that meant little now. Then came the interrogations. The quiet rooms where Allied officers asked questions, not about battles, but about office work, units, and commands. What was your duty? Whom did you report to? Did you ever see prisoners? Some women answered easily, relieved to be heard. Others broke down, haunted by memories they had tried to bury beneath obedience. In British-run camps like Fallingbostel and Hildesheim, questionnaires replaced accusations. Each woman had to fill out a form declaring her position, duties, and political affiliation. Those deemed uncompromised were eventually marked for release. Those who had served in SS-affiliated offices or concentration camp administrations were held longer for investigation. The process was methodical, impersonal, a bureaucracy dismantling another bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the physical conditions were harsh. Food was scarce, winter clothing non-existent. Typhus and dysentery spread easily. The Red Cross provided aid when possible, but the Allies themselves struggled to supply millions of German POWs still waiting for repatriation. Yet amid the hardship, a strange transformation began. Without their uniforms, the women began to see each other differently. Rank no longer mattered. The typist and the nurse, the clerk and the radio operator, all were equal now, stripped down to survival. Some helped in camp hospitals, others cooked for guards or cared for the sick. Slowly, human gestures replaced military routine. One British medical officer noted, "They work without complaint, not as soldiers, but as women trying to be useful again." Still, the emotional landscape remained fragile. Nightmares were common. The sound of boots or engines sent shivers through the barracks. And when word came of Germany's cities in ruins, Berlin divided, Hamburg starving, Dresden a memory, despair deepened. A few women were allowed to write letters. Most received none in return. Their families were displaced or dead, their homes occupied by strangers. Many realized that even when they were freed, there might be nowhere left to go. For some, the camp became a strange refuge, harsh but predictable. Outside lay the unknown, a country shamed, occupied, and uncertain of its own future. Historians later described this period as the gray zone of surrender, a psychological limbo between complicity and victimhood. The women were not criminals in the legal sense, yet they carried the weight of association. They had served a regime that promised glory and delivered ruin. Now they served time in silence, waiting for history to decide who they had been. The Long Return, Silence as Survival. By late 1946, the camps began to empty. The Allied Control Council had shifted its focus from punishment to reconstruction. The world was moving forward, rebuilding, reorganizing, dividing Germany into East and West. The women who had once stood in the rain watching their uniforms burn were quietly released, one by one, into a country they no longer recognized. Most returned to ruins. Berlin was a skeleton of stone. Hamburg's port, a wasteland of twisted cranes and scorched warehouses. Food was rationed. Trains ran irregularly. Entire families had vanished or scattered across the occupation zones. They came back not as heroes, not even as victims, but as shadows. The new Germany had little place for them. The public was eager to forget, to erase the collective humiliation of defeat. And so, those who had served the Reich's war machine learned the first rule of survival in the post-war years: silence. They did not speak of the camps, or the uniforms, or the day the fires consumed them. Many hid their service records when applying for work. Some married Allied soldiers or local civilians, choosing to bury their past under new names. Others retreated into domestic life. Mothers, wives, and secretaries once again, careful never to reveal what those uniforms had once meant. But the past lingered. At night, it returned in fragments: the click of a typewriter, the smell of fuel, the sight of smoke curling upward against a gray sky. In 1948, as the Marshall Plan began to rebuild West Germany, denazification officially ended. Millions of Germans were reclassified as followers rather than perpetrators. The nation needed workers, not guilt. Files were closed, records sealed, and the memory of the uniform burnings slipped quietly into obscurity. Only decades later, in the 1980s and 1990s, did historians and journalists begin to unearth this forgotten story? Through interviews and declassified documents, they pieced together testimonies, fragments of memory from women who had lived through both loyalty and loss. One former SS clerk, interviewed anonymously, said, "I was proud once. I thought I was serving something greater. But when I watched the uniform burn, I understood that belief can make good people blind." Another, a Luftwaffe communications assistant, recalled, "We didn't know the whole truth. We only knew our orders. But when they burned the uniforms, we knew the truth was larger than us, and it had already judged us." By then, most were old. Their hands trembled as they spoke, voices trailing off when memories grew too heavy. They had carried the silence for 40 years, not out of defiance, but out of shame. In East Germany, the story was even more buried. Under Soviet control, the narrative of anti-fascism dominated public memory. Former auxiliaries were viewed with suspicion and rarely mentioned. The uniform burnings were never acknowledged. Too symbolic, too intimate, too human. Yet the legacy of those moments endured quietly, shaping the moral consciousness of a generation that grew up surrounded by absence. Parents who would not speak, photographs missing from albums, uniforms erased from attics and archives. The fire that consumed the WWII, symbols of the Reich, also consumed a part of personal identity that could never be reclaimed. When these women looked at post-war Germany's new institutions, democracy, reconstruction, reconciliation, they saw a nation rebuilt on forgetting. And perhaps that forgetting was necessary, but beneath that silence, something remained, an unspoken reminder of how easily belief can turn ordinary lives into instruments of ideology. Their punishment had not been prison or death. It had been memory, and memory never fully burns. Ashes of belief. History often remembers the men, the generals, the soldiers, the tyrants who gave the orders. But behind every regime, there are those who kept its engines running, quietly, efficiently, believing they were serving their country. The German women who once wore the uniforms of the Third Reich were not commanders of armies or architects of genocide. Yet they were part of a system that made both possible. They answered phones, filed reports, relayed codes, issued supplies. Their hands never held rifles, but their labor kept the rifles firing. When they were ordered to burn their uniforms, it was not just an act of surrender. It was a reckoning, a symbolic severing of identity from ideology. For the first time, they saw their reflection not as servants of duty, but as witnesses of delusion. Fire became confession. Smoke became silence. And as the ashes rose into the gray skies of a broken Germany, a question lingered, one that history still asks. How does belief blind a nation so completely that ordinary people become instruments of destruction, all while thinking they are doing right? The answer lies not in the grand speeches or the battlefields, but in the quiet obedience of millions who never asked why. For the women who burned their uniforms, the war never truly ended. It lived on in memory, in silence, and in the uneasy knowledge that faith in authority, once misplaced, can destroy everything it touches. History's lesson is simple, yet eternal. When conscience sleeps, uniforms become prisons, and sometimes the only way to be free is to watch them burn.